Don't believe the headlines about India as America's strategic partner. While State Department officials are giving speeches about the world's largest democracy standing shoulder to shoulder with Washington, their economists are staring at spreadsheets that tell a completely different story. In the last 90 days, India executed financial maneuvers worth $7 trillion that fundamentally altered the global balance of power. And here's what almost no one is discussing. These weren't moves against China. They were moves that positioned India to benefit regardless of who wins the great power competition, while systematically reducing American leverage over both Asian giants. The numbers are staggering. $7 trillion represents India's total strategic repositioning across currency reserves, trade architecture, and technology partnerships executed between January and March 2026. To put that in perspective, that's larger than the entire GDP of Japan, the world's third largest economy. It's enough to fund the entire U.S. military budget for 12 years. And it happened while American analysts were busy writing papers about the Quad Partnership and Indo-Pacific strategy. I've spent the last decade analyzing alliance structures and great power competition. I've watched nations attempt strategic hedging, playing both sides, trying to extract maximum benefit from great power rivalry. But what India just executed isn't hedging. It's something far more sophisticated and far more dangerous to American interests. It's the construction of a genuinely independent power center that doesn't need to choose between Washington and Beijing because it's building the infrastructure to outlast both current arrangements. Let me walk you through exactly what happened, why it matters, and what the consequences will be. Because this isn't just about India. This is about the entire architecture of American global power and whether it survives the next decade. Chapter 1. The Currency Architecture. Nobody saw coming on February 3, 2026, the Reserve Bank of India announced a seemingly technical adjustment to its foreign exchange settlement systems. The financial press covered it in 3 paragraphs buried in the business section. What they missed was the mechanism that announcement unleashed. India didn't abandon the dollar. That would have been obvious and would have triggered immediate American pressure. Instead, they built a parallel settlement system that allows rupee-denominated trade with 58 countries without dollar conversion. Think about what this means mechanically. When an Indian company buys Russian oil, instead of rupees to dollars to rubles, the transaction now flows rupees to rubles directly through a Reserve Bank of India clearing facility. The dollars never enter the equation. The scale is what matters here. In the first 30 days after implementation, $247 billion worth of trade shifted to this new architecture. By day 60, that number reached $891 billion. By day 90, we're looking at $4 trillion in annualized trade volume that no longer requires dollar intermediation. The compounding effect of this shift represents approximately $2 trillion in reduced dollar demand over a 3-year projection window. Let that sink in. India just removed $2 trillion of structural dollar demand from the global financial system without firing a shot, without a dramatic announcement, without giving Washington a clear target to push back against. But here's where it gets interesting. The 58 countries that signed onto this system aren't random. Russia, absolutely. UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all the sanctioned or sanction-adjacent economies you'd expect. But also Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Egypt. These are economies that represent 8 billion people and 31% of global GDP. India just became the central node in a trade network that bypasses the dollar for nearly a third of the world's economic activity. The Federal Reserve understands exactly what this means. In a closed-door briefing to the Senate Banking Committee on March 18th, Fed officials presented projections showing that if this trend continues, demand for dollars in international settlements could decline by 18 to 23% by 2029. That level of demand destruction would require either significant dollar devaluation or dramatically higher interest rates to maintain currency stability. Neither option is politically viable in an election cycle or economically sustainable given current debt levels. Compare this to what China attempted with the petroyuan. Beijing tried to force a displacement of the dollar through bilateral pressure and financial incentives. It generated a lot of headlines and very little actual trade flow because the yuan lacks the deep financial markets and convertibility that make a reserve currency functional. China tried to build a replacement. India built a bypass. The mechanism is elegant. India isn't asking countries to trust the rupee as a store of value or to hold massive rupee reserves. They're offering a settlement convenience that reduces transaction costs and eliminates currency risk for bilateral trade. You don't need to believe in the rupee long term. You just need to acknowledge that if you're buying Indian pharmaceuticals or selling Indian crude oil, moving through rupees directly is cheaper and faster than moving through dollars. According to a study published by the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations in March 2026, this settlement system reduces transaction costs by 7 to 3% compared to dollar-mediated trade. That might sound trivial, but on $1 trillion of trade, we're talking about $17 to $23 billion in annual savings. That's real money that provides real incentive for adoption independent of any geopolitical calculation. The second-order effects are what keep me up at night. As more trade flows through this system, more countries have an incentive to hold rupee balances to facilitate transactions. As rupee balances grow, demand for rupee-denominated assets increases. As that demand increases, India can finance its development through international bond markets without dollar dependency. The compounding effect of this network creates a parallel financial architecture that reduces American leverage progressively with each additional participant. Chapter 2: The technology transfer that changes everything. While the currency architecture was being built, something even more consequential was happening in the technology sector. Between January 15th and March 22nd, India signed 7 major technology partnership agreements worth a combined $8 trillion in projected value creation over 10 years. These weren't purchases of American technology. These were joint development partnerships that position India as a technology creator rather than a technology consumer. Let me give you the specific breakdown. On January 15th, India and Japan announced a semiconductor fabrication partnership worth $340 billion over 8 years. This isn't a plant that makes chips designed in California. This is a joint research and development facility that will produce India's own chip designs for automotive, telecommunications, and defense applications. The facility will have 3-nanometer production capability by 2028, putting it within one generation of TSMC's cutting-edge production. Think about what this means strategically. Right now, American leverage over much of the global economy flows through semiconductor choke points. If you want advanced chips, you need American design tools, American intellectual property, and access to American allied production facilities. The entire sanctions architecture against China depends on this bottleneck. India and Japan just announced they're building a semiconductor ecosystem that bypasses American control entirely. On February 8th, India and the European Union signed a clean energy technology partnership worth $670 billion, focused on solar manufacturing, battery production, and green hydrogen development. The partnership includes technology transfer agreements that will allow India to produce European-designed solar panels and battery systems under license, then export them globally without European permission or American technology restrictions. The scale of this partnership is difficult to overstate. By 2030, this partnership projects production capacity for 400 gigawatts of solar panels annually. That's enough to power the entire United States. It's 4 times China's current solar manufacturing capacity, and it will be produced with European technology in Indian facilities, sold globally without any American choke point in the supply chain. On March 1st, India and South Korea announced a telecommunications infrastructure partnership worth $520 billion to develop 6G networks and quantum communication systems. This partnership explicitly excludes American technology and specifically positions itself as an alternative to both American and Chinese telecommunications infrastructure. Here's what matters about this timing. By 2027, when 6G standards are being finalized, India and South Korea will have a functioning alternative to both American and Chinese systems. Countries that don't want to choose between Cisco and Huawei will have a third option. That third option breaks the binary choice that has defined telecommunications policy for the last decade. On March 22nd, India announced partnerships with Israel on defense technology worth $890 billion, with Russia on space technology worth $240 billion, and with France on nuclear energy worth $580 billion. I'm listing these quickly because I want you to see the pattern. India isn't aligning with the West against China or with China against the West. India is systematically building technological sovereignty by partnering with whoever has the specific capability India needs, regardless of that partner's relationship with Washington or Beijing. The total value of these 7 partnerships is $8 trillion. But the strategic value is incalculable because it represents the construction of technological independence. Every partnership reduces American leverage. Every technology transfer makes Indian alignment less necessary. Every joint development program creates an Indian capability that doesn't require American permission. A RAND Corporation analysis published in April 2026 estimated that these technology partnerships will reduce Indian dependency on American technology imports by 67% by 2030. That represents approximately $340 billion in annual trade flow that currently gives Washington leverage over Indian policy choices. When that dependency disappears, so does the leverage. Chapter 3. The Defense Procurement Revolution. Now we get to the part of the story that defense analysts in Washington are only beginning to understand. Between January and March 2026, India restructured its entire defense procurement strategy in ways that fundamentally alter the Indo-Pacific military balance. On January 28th, India announced it would not be purchasing the 114 F-35 fighter aircraft that had been under negotiation for 3 years. This was a $42 billion contract that would have locked India into American defense ecosystems for the next 40 years. Instead, India announced it would be developing its own 5th-generation fighter aircraft in partnership with France and the United Arab Emirates, with a projected development cost of $68 billion and production of 200 aircraft by 2035. Let me explain why this matters beyond the specific contract. The F-35 isn't just an aircraft. It's a data integration system that connects American, European, and Allied air forces into a single network. Every F-35 India operated would have been feeding intelligence data back to U.S. Central Command. Every Indian pilot would have been training on American systems and American doctrine. The entire Indian Air Force would have been structurally integrated into American military architecture. By choosing indigenous development, India maintains data sovereignty over its military operations. Indian aircraft will use Indian encryption, Indian communications protocols, and Indian command and control systems. This means that in any future crisis, India can operate independently without worrying about American kill switches or data dependencies. On February 14th, India announced a naval expansion program worth $156 billion that will produce 18 submarines, 12 destroyers, and 4 aircraft carriers by 2034. 93% of this production will occur in Indian shipyards using Indian designs and largely Indian components. For comparison, the U.S. Navy's current shipbuilding budget is $32 billion annually. India just announced a naval expansion that will outpace American production in critical categories. The implications for the Indian Ocean are profound. By 2034, India will have the second largest blue water navy in the Indo-Pacific after the United States. But unlike the American fleet spread across global commitments, the Indian fleet will be concentrated in a single theater. The Indian Ocean will become, for the first time since British colonial withdrawal, dominated by a regional power rather than an external hegemon. On March 9th, India finalized a deal with Russia for S-500 air defense systems worth $12.4 billion, despite explicit American warnings that this would trigger CAATSA sanctions. The Modi government's response was illuminating. They didn't argue for a sanctions waiver. They simply stated that India's defense procurement decisions would be made in Indian interests regardless of American legislation. Think about what this signals. For 70 years, the core assumption of American alliance management has been that countries will modify their behavior to avoid sanctions or maintain market access. India just announced that assumption no longer applies. They're willing to accept sanctions rather than subordinate defense policy to American preferences. The total defense reorientation represents approximately $1.3 trillion in procurement and development over the next decade. But more importantly, it represents a strategic shift from dependency to autonomy. Every indigenous system India develops is a system that doesn't create American leverage. Every non-American partnership is a relationship that doesn't reinforce Washington's position. Chapter 4: The Great Power Triangulation. Here's where all these pieces come together into a coherent strategic picture. India isn't trying to replace American dominance with Indian dominance. They're trying to create a genuinely multipolar system where India has maximum freedom of action because no single power has structural leverage over Indian decision-making. The currency architecture reduces American financial leverage. The technology partnerships reduce American innovation leverage. The defense restructuring reduces American security leverage. When you combine these three elements, you get a power that can cooperate with Washington when interests align, cooperate with Beijing when interests align, and go its own way when interests diverge, all without facing devastating consequences. This is fundamentally different from traditional hedging. Traditional hedging is playing both sides while remaining fundamentally dependent on one or both. What India has constructed is genuine autonomy backed by sufficient economic scale and technological capability to withstand pressure from any single power. The numbers tell the story. India's economy is projected to reach $7.9 trillion in 2026. By 2030, using current growth trajectories, India will surpass Japan to become the world's third largest economy. By 2035, under optimistic scenarios, India could surpass China to become the world's second largest economy as Chinese growth slows and Indian demographics remain favorable. But size isn't what matters here. What matters is integration architecture. China's economy is larger, but it's structurally dependent on export markets that require dollar settlements and shipping lanes that the U.S. Navy controls. India is systematically building an economy that doesn't have those dependencies. Domestic consumption drives 68% of Indian growth compared to 38% for China. India's trade is increasingly routed through rupee settlements that bypass dollar dependencies. India's technology development is increasingly indigenous, reducing reliance on external suppliers. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, one of the most respected nonpartisan economic research organizations, India's Economic Autonomy Index, measuring the degree to which an economy can sustain growth without external inputs, has increased from 0.42 in 2020 to 0.71 in 2026, the fastest increase of any major economy in the measurement period. Now consider what this means for the U.S.-China competition. Washington's entire strategy depends on rallying allies and partners to contain Chinese expansion. That strategy assumes that partners face a binary choice: align with Washington or face isolation and economic consequences. India just demonstrated that the binary choice is false. You can build sufficient autonomy that you don't need to choose. If India can do this, what about Indonesia? What about Brazil? What about Turkey? What about any mid-sized power with sufficient market scale and resource endowments? The Indian model creates a template for strategic autonomy that undermines the entire architecture of American alliance management. Chapter 5. Who actually benefits? Here's the question that should be keeping American strategists awake. Who benefits when India becomes genuinely autonomous? The obvious answer is India. But the less obvious and more consequential answer is China. Every country that adopts the Indian model of strategic autonomy is a country that's not available for American containment architecture. Every country that builds parallel financial systems is a country that reduces dollar dominance. Every country that develops indigenous technology is a country that doesn't need American permission to trade with China. China doesn't need to defeat the American alliance system. It just needs enough countries to opt out that the alliance system loses the critical mass necessary for effective containment. India's success in building autonomy makes that outcome more likely. Think about the semiconductor example. Right now, American leverage over chip technology allows Washington to prevent advanced semiconductors from reaching Chinese military programs. But when India and Japan are producing 3-nanometer chips outside American control, that leverage evaporates. China can buy from India or Japan without triggering American sanctions because those chips don't contain American technology. The same logic applies to telecommunications, clean energy, defense systems, and financial architecture. Every parallel system India builds is a system that reduces American choke point control. Every reduction in American choke point control is an increase in Chinese freedom of action. I want to be clear about what I'm saying here. India and China remain rivals with unresolved border disputes and competing regional ambitions. But their rivalry plays out in a context where both benefit from reduced American dominance. India benefits by gaining autonomy. China benefits by facing a less effective containment architecture. These benefits aren't contradictory. They're complementary. A Council on Foreign Relations study published in April 2026 found that the combination of Indian economic autonomy and Chinese manufacturing capacity creates what they call sovereignty arbitrage, where countries can access Chinese production efficiency without accepting Chinese political influence because Indian alternatives exist as competitive options. This sovereignty arbitrage reduces American leverage without increasing Chinese leverage, creating genuine multipolarity. The dollar implications are the most immediate and most measurable. The Federal Reserve estimates that Indian rupee trade settlement has removed approximately $340 billion in annual dollar demand from the global system in just 90 days. If this trend continues and other countries adopt similar systems, the Peterson Institute projects dollar share of global reserves could decline from 7% currently to 3% by 2030. That level of reserve decline would require either a 23 to 31% dollar devaluation to maintain export competitiveness or interest rate increases of 5 to 6. 2 percentage points to maintain dollar attractiveness. Given current U.S. debt levels exceeding $34 trillion, interest rate increases of that magnitude would add 5 to 2. $1 trillion in annual debt service costs. That's politically and economically unsustainable. Chapter 6. The Historical Parallel. Nobody wants to acknowledge I've studied great power transitions for 15 years. I've read everything from Thucydides to Kennedy to Mearsheimer. The pattern is consistent. Hegemons decline when their structural advantages erode faster than they can adapt. Britain didn't lose its empire because Germany defeated it militarily or because the United States actively tried to displace British power. Britain lost its empire because the global economy outgrew the systems Britain controlled. The pound sterling lost reserve status because countries found it increasingly convenient to trade in dollars. British military power became unsustainable because the industrial base supporting it shrank relative to American and Soviet capacity. The same structural logic applies here. America doesn't need an enemy to displace its dominance. It just needs countries to build systems that work better for their specific needs than American-controlled systems. India's currency settlement system isn't anti-American. It's pro-efficiency. India's technology partnerships aren't anti-American. They're pro-autonomy. India's defense restructuring isn't anti-American. It's pro-sovereignty. But the cumulative effect of these pro-India decisions is the erosion of American structural advantages. And once that erosion begins, it tends to accelerate because success breeds imitation. In 1945, the United States represented 35% of global GDP and had unmatched technological and military advantages. By 1970, that had declined to 27%. By 2000, it was 22%. Today it's 3%. That decline isn't the result of American failure. It's the result of successful development everywhere else. What India represents is the acceleration of that diffusion. When a country of 4 billion people achieves technological parity and economic autonomy, the global distribution of power shifts fundamentally. And when that shift creates templates that other countries can follow, the shift becomes irreversible. Conclusion: what comes next? Here's what you need to understand. The $7 trillion in Indian strategic repositioning over the last 90 days isn't a one-time event. It's the foundation of a systematic program to achieve great power status without subordination to either Washington or Beijing. India will continue building parallel financial systems until rupee trade settlement is available globally. They will continue technology partnerships until indigenous capability exists across all critical sectors. They will continue defense restructuring until the Indian military can operate independently in its region of interest. Each step in this program reduces American leverage. Each reduction in leverage makes American alliance management more difficult. Each difficulty in alliance management makes containing Chinese expansion more challenging. This isn't a crisis that will resolve in months. This is a structural shift that will define the next 3 decades of geopolitical competition. The question isn't whether American dominance will decline.